At 06:47 hours on March 2nd, 1945, a 23-year-old former auto mechanic from Terre Haute, Indiana, sat in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt at 28,000 feet above the Rhine Valley. His name was Staff Sergeant William "Billy" Declan Hargrove. 6 months earlier, he had been fixing transmissions at his father's garage on Wabash Avenue, earning $32 a week. Now he was about to do something that every flight manual in the United States Army Air Forces said was impossible. His hydraulic system was destroyed. His flight controls were bleeding fluid across the fuselage floor. His rudder pedals had gone completely dead. Two Focke-Wulf 190s were closing from his 6 o'clock at 400 miles per hour. And in the next 47 minutes, Billy Hargrove, a man with exactly 94 hours of combat flight time, would shoot down not 1, not 3, not 5, but 10 confirmed enemy aircraft flying a fighter that should not have been able to turn, climb, or maneuver in any meaningful way. He did it using a technique so unorthodox, so reckless, so fundamentally against every principle of aerial combat, that when the intelligence officers debriefed him 3 days later, they initially refused to believe his account. They called it a fabrication. They called it impossible. They called it insane. The gun camera footage proved every single word of it. This is the story they never taught you. And it begins not in the sky over Germany, but in a freezing hangar in eastern England 4 months before that impossible morning. In November 1944, the Allied air campaign over Western Europe was winning the war. But it was winning at a horrific cost that the newspapers back home carefully avoided printing in full detail. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases across England, had lost 4,145 heavy bombers since the beginning of operations. That number alone is staggering, but the human mathematics behind it are worse. Each B-17 carried 10 men. Each B-24 carried 10 men. The fighter escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, tasked with protecting those bombers, were being shot down at a rate of 31 aircraft per week during the autumn of 1944. The Luftwaffe was wounded, but not dead. German fighter production had actually increased during 1944, despite the bombing campaign. Albert Speer's dispersal program had moved aircraft factories into forests, tunnels, and salt mines across the Reich. Monthly fighter production peaked at 3,375 aircraft in September 1944. The pilots were younger, less experienced, desperate, but they flew aircraft that were in many cases technologically superior to their American counterparts. The Focke-Wulf 190D, the Dora variant, could outclimb and outrun a P-47 at altitude. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was entering service in growing numbers, capable of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour, faster than anything the Allies could put in the sky. The specific problem was the Ardennes corridor and the Rhine crossing approaches. German interceptor units had concentrated along a 200-mile stretch of airspace between Cologne and Frankfurt. This was the killing zone. American bomber formations entering this corridor faced coordinated attacks from 3 Jagdgeschwader fighter wings operating over 400 aircraft. Losses in this sector averaged 8.7% per mission during November and December 1944. The acceptable loss rate, the number that allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue as a sustainable operation, was 4%. They were losing men at more than double the sustainable rate. Fighter escort tactics had been refined repeatedly. The Thunderbolts and Mustangs flew in relay, picking up bomber formations at assigned checkpoints, engaging German interceptors, then handing off to the next escort group as fuel dictated. But the Germans had adapted. They had learned to wait to let the first escort wave pass, then to strike the bombers during the gap between relay exchanges. 12 minutes. That was the average gap between escort handoffs. 12 minutes of unprotected sky. In 12 minutes, a coordinated Sturmbach attack group could destroy an entire bomber squadron. Every tactical solution had been tried. Closer formation flying increased defensive firepower, but made the bombers easier targets for rockets. Wider formations reduced vulnerability to area weapons, but weakened the mutual protection of overlapping machine gun coverage. Higher altitude flying put the bombers above the effective ceiling of light flak, but degraded bombing accuracy and increased engine failures. There was no clean answer. The men kept dying. The missions kept flying. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody was paying attention to. William Declan Hargrove was born on June 14, 1921, in Terre Haute, Indiana, the second of 4 children. His father, Robert Hargrove, operated a 2-bay automotive repair shop on Wabash Avenue that specialized in truck transmissions and heavy equipment. Billy grew up inside engines. By age 12, he could disassemble and rebuild a Ford Flathead 5.8 in under 6 hours. By 16, he was the shop's primary mechanic, handling jobs his father's experienced employees couldn't solve. He had a gift that defied formal education. Billy Hargrove never finished high school. He dropped out at 17 to work full-time after his mother died of pneumonia in the winter of 1938. But his mechanical intuition was extraordinary. He understood systems. He could listen to an engine and identify a failing bearing by the frequency of its vibration. He could feel a transmission's health through the shift lever detecting wear patterns invisible to instruments. When the draft notice arrived in March 1943, Hargrove expected assignment to a motor pool. Instead, the Army's classification system, in one of its occasional moments of accidental brilliance, identified his mechanical aptitude scores as compatible with aviation mechanics. He was sent to Chanute Field, Illinois for aircraft maintenance training. There, Instructor Sergeant Thomas Whitfield noticed something unusual. Hargrove didn't just memorize maintenance procedures. He understood why hydraulic systems failed. He could predict failure modes that weren't in any technical manual. Whitfield recommended Hargrove for advanced training. By September 1943, he was a certified aircraft mechanic specializing in hydraulic and flight control systems. He was assigned to the 356th Fighter Group at Martlesham Heath, England, maintaining P-47 Thunderbolts. For 6 months, Hargrove fixed broken fighters. He developed a reputation for solving problems that baffled other mechanics. A recurring hydraulic failure in the P-47's landing gear retraction system had grounded 3 aircraft. The official maintenance protocol called for complete system replacement, a 4-day procedure. Hargrove traced the fault to a microscopic crack in a brass fitting that propagated under thermal cycling. He designed a reinforcement sleeve from scrap aluminum that eliminated the failure mode entirely. The fix took 90 minutes. And then one night that changed everything. Hargrove was working late in Hangar 7, repairing hydraulic damage on a P-47 that had taken 20mm cannon fire over Mersburg. The hydraulic lines were destroyed. Standard procedure required complete replacement, grounding the aircraft for a week. But Hargrove stared at the severed lines at the dead control surfaces, and he saw something that no engineer, no pilot, no tactician had considered. He saw a way to fly without hydraulics. The idea was so radical that when Hargrove first explained it to his crew chief, Master Sergeant Paul Drennan, the older man literally laughed. What Hargrove proposed was this: the P-47D. Thunderbolt's flight controls operated through a combination of hydraulic boost and mechanical linkage. If the hydraulic system failed, conventional wisdom said the aircraft became unflyable because the control surfaces required hydraulic pressure to overcome aerodynamic forces at combat speeds. But Hargrove had noticed something during months of repair work. The mechanical backup linkages, designed only for low-speed emergency use, could theoretically be modified to provide partial control authority at higher speeds if the pilot used a specific combination of trim tab settings, asymmetric throttle manipulation, and a technique Hargrove called pulse deflection, rapid short inputs, rather than sustained control pressure. It was not in any manual. It contradicted the P-47's engineering specifications. Republic Aviation. The manufacturer would have called it dangerous, unauthorized, and probably suicidal. When Hargrove submitted a written proposal through his crew chief to the group's engineering officer, Captain Leonard Marsh, the response was immediate and emphatic. Request denied. Under no circumstances will maintenance personnel modify flight control systems outside manufacturer specifications. The liability alone could ground the entire group. But Hargrove couldn't let it go. He had seen too many P-47s come back with hydraulic damage, their pilots barely able to land their aircraft written off as total losses. He had counted 17 Thunderbolts in 6 months lost not to enemy fire directly, but to hydraulic failure caused by combat damage. 17 aircraft, 17 pilots, some dead, some prisoners, some lucky enough to bail out. All because the hydraulic system had a single point of failure that nobody was willing to address. So Billy Hargrove did what any stubborn mechanic from Terre Haute would do. He ignored the rejection and built it anyway. Working after hours in Hangar 7 with 2 trusted assistants, Corporal James Fenton and Private First Class Aloysius Quan Hargrove, spent 3 weeks developing his modification. He fabricated reinforced mechanical linkage components from salvaged aircraft parts. He designed a trim tab preset configuration that would allow basic pitch and roll control without hydraulic pressure. He created a 1-page emergency procedure card that a pilot could follow in combat conditions. The test came on January 17, 1945. Lieutenant Robert Anson Whitmore, a 25-year-old pilot from Savannah, Georgia, who owed Hargrove a favor for keeping his aircraft flying through December's brutal weather, agreed to test the system. The arrangement was unofficial, unauthorized. If anything went wrong, all 3 men would face court-martial. Whitmore took off at 05:30 before dawn, before the base was fully operational, before anyone in authority could notice. At 8,000 feet over the North Sea, he shut down his hydraulic system completely. For exactly 14 seconds, Whitmore believed he was going to die. The P-47 dropped its nose, the controls went heavy, the aircraft began an uncommanded roll to the right. Then Whitmore followed Hargrove's emergency card. Trim tabs to preset position, throttle adjustments for pitch, pulse deflection on the mechanical linkages, short, sharp inputs rather than sustained pulls, and the aircraft responded. Not smoothly, not elegantly. The Thunderbolt flew like a drunk mule on a frozen lake, Whitmore reported afterward. But it flew, it turned, it climbed, it descended under control. Whitmore executed basic combat maneuvers for 22 minutes, then reactivated the hydraulic system and landed normally. The data was undeniable. Hargrove's modification worked. A P-47 could maintain combat capability with a completely failed hydraulic system. When Captain Marsh learned about the unauthorized test flight, he was furious. Hargrove and Whitmore were both written up for violations of maintenance protocols and unauthorized flight operations. But Marsh was also a pragmatist. He had lost pilots to hydraulic failure. He had written condolence letters to families. He looked at Whitmore's flight data, looked at Hargrove's modification specifications, and made a decision that went against every regulation in his authority. He buried the disciplinary paperwork and forwarded Hargrove's technical report to the group commander. The report reached Colonel Philip Gruber's desk on January 24, 1945. Gruber read it twice, called Hargrove to his office, and asked one question. "Can you teach every pilot in this group your technique in 2 weeks?" Hargrove said yes. What neither of them knew was that in exactly 37 days, Billy Hargrove himself would need that technique not as a mechanic watching from the ground, but as a pilot fighting for his life at 28,000 feet. Because the Army Air Forces, in its infinite and occasionally catastrophic wisdom, had decided that Staff Sergeant William Hargrove's mechanical genius made him too valuable to waste on the ground. They were transferring him to flight status, and they were sending him directly into the killing zone over the Rhine. But that impossible morning, those 10 enemy fighters, and the 47 minutes that rewrote the rules of aerial combat, those belonged to Part 2. And what happened next was something even Billy Hargrove, with all his mechanical brilliance, could never have predicted. In Part 1, a 23-year-old auto mechanic named Billy Hargrove discovered that a P-47 Thunderbolt could fly without hydraulics, using a combination of trim tabs, asymmetric throttle, and pulse deflection. His unauthorized test proved the impossible. His technique worked. And the Army Air Forces, recognizing his mechanical genius, made a decision that would change everything. They transferred him from the ground to the cockpit. But convincing one colonel at one airbase in England was one thing. Convincing the entire 8th Air Force command structure to adopt an unauthorized modification invented by a staff sergeant with no engineering degree was something else entirely. The institutional resistance Billy Hargrove was about to face made German flak look almost reasonable by comparison. In the first 2 months of 1945, the 8th Air Force lost 214 fighter aircraft. 41 of those losses involved hydraulic system failures caused by combat damage. 41 pilots. 41 families receiving telegrams. 41 preventable deaths. And this is where everything got worse. Colonel Gruber's endorsement of Hargrove's technique traveled up the chain of command exactly as far as the desk of Brigadier General Howard Clement Strickland, Deputy Commander of 8th Fighter Command. Strickland was 54 years old, a career officer who had flown biplanes in the 1920s and commanded a training wing in Texas before receiving his combat assignment in 1943. He had never shot down an enemy aircraft. He had never taken flak. He had never nursed a crippled fighter home across the English Channel with fuel gauges bouncing on empty. What he had was 30 years of institutional authority and an absolute conviction that maintenance personnel did not redesign aircraft systems. The meeting took place on February 3, 1945 in Strickland's office at 8th Fighter Command Headquarters at Bushy Hall, Hertfordshire. Hargrove stood at attention in a room designed to intimidate. Walnut paneling, portraits of generals, a mahogany desk the size of a small aircraft carrier. Gruber stood beside him, having staked his professional reputation on this mechanic's idea. Strickland didn't look up from the report for 90 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of a man accustomed to ending careers. You want me to authorize a flight control modification designed by an enlisted mechanic with no engineering credentials, tested exactly once in an unauthorized flight, that should have resulted in a court-martial, and deploy it across every P-47 group in the 8th Air Force. Is that an accurate summary? Colonel Gruber held his ground. General, the data speaks for itself. Lieutenant Whitmore maintained full combat maneuverability for 22 minutes with zero hydraulic pressure. The modification requires no permanent structural changes. It can be installed in 4 hours per aircraft using existing parts. Strickland leaned back. And when one of my pilots crashes because his controls lock up following your mechanic's shade tree modification, who faces the inquiry board? You, Sergeant Hargrove, or me? The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Hargrove broke it. Sir, 41 pilots in 2 months. That is the number dying right now under current procedures. My modification cannot make a dead hydraulic system worse. It can only give pilots options they do not currently have. Strickland's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being addressed directly by enlisted men. Sergeant, you are a mechanic. You fix what engineers design. You do not redesign what engineers have built. Republic Aviation employs 3,000 engineers who designed the P-47's hydraulic system. Are you telling me you know better than 3,000 engineers? Hargrove did not hesitate. No, sir. I am telling you, I know what breaks and why. Those 3,000 engineers have never pulled shrapnel out of a hydraulic line at 2 in the morning with a pilot's blood still on the cowling. Gruber intervened before Strickland could respond. General, I am requesting a formal evaluation, not deployment, an evaluation. If the system fails under controlled testing, we walk away. If it works, we save pilots. Strickland denied the request. His written response dated February 4th stated that unauthorized modifications to flight-critical systems represent an unacceptable risk to aircraft and personnel. The matter is closed. But Hargrove found an unexpected ally. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellen Forsyth, 39 years old, served as Chief Statistical Analyst for 8th Fighter Command. Her job was numbers. Loss rates, mission success percentages, equipment failure analysis. The cold mathematics of air warfare. Forsyth had been tracking hydraulic-related losses for 11 months. She had compiled a 47-page report documenting the failure patterns, the circumstances, the outcomes. Her data showed that a P-47 suffering complete hydraulic failure in combat had a 91% fatality rate. 91%. Of every 100 pilots who lost hydraulic pressure over enemy territory, 91 died. Forsyth had submitted her report 3 times through official channels. 3 times it had been filed and forgotten. When she heard about Hargrove's modification through the headquarters rumor network, she requested a meeting with him within 24 hours. They met in the maintenance hangar at Martlesham Heath on February 7th. Forsyth studied the modification for 3 hours, asking questions that surprised Hargrove with their technical precision. She understood stress loads, failure cascades, redundancy principles. She was not an engineer, but she spoke the language of systems and probability. Your technique reduces the fatality rate from 91% to what she asked. Hargrove was honest. I do not know. One test is not a statistical sample. But if it gives a pilot even partial control authority, the survival rate has to improve. Even going from 91% fatal to 50% fatal saves 20 pilots a year. Forsyth nodded. I can get you your formal evaluation, but not through Strickland. She had a direct channel to Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, Strickland's superior. Kepner was a different breed of general, a former enlisted man himself, a balloon pilot in World War I, a pragmatist who valued results over protocol. Forsyth placed her 47-page report on Kepner's desk alongside Hargrove's technical proposal. Kepner read both documents that evening. The formal evaluation was authorized on February 12, 1945, but the conditions were brutal. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 chance. The test would be conducted at Bovingdon Airfield, under observation, by a technical review board comprising 3 Republic aviation engineers, 2 8th Fighter Command staff officers, and General Kepner himself. If the modification failed, if the aircraft crashed, if anything went wrong, Hargrove would face court-martial, Gruber would face reassignment, and Forsyth would face career termination. 1 chance. No margin for error. The day of the test arrived, February 19, 1945. Bovingdon Airfield. Temperature 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest at 12 knots. Ceiling overcast at 6,000 feet. The evaluation aircraft, a P-47D serial number 42-26387, sat on the flight line with Hargrove's modifications installed. Lieutenant Whitmore again volunteered to fly. He understood the stakes. They all did. The review board assembled in the control tower. The 3 Republic aviation engineers, Thomas Garrett, David Summerfield, and Harold Chung, examined the modification before the flight. Their assessment was skeptical. Garrett, the senior engineer, stated for the record that the modification circumvented designed safety margins and that Republic aviation could not endorse its use. His colleagues concurred. Kepner listened, said nothing, nodded at Whitmore. At 0914 hours, Whitmore lifted off from runway 25. The Thunderbolt climbed through the overcast into clear sky above. At 12,000 feet, he radioed the tower. Altitude 12,000. Preparing to deactivate hydraulic system. Hargrove stood in the tower hands, gripping the radio console. Forsyth stood beside him, a clipboard pressed against her chest, recording everything. Whitmore shut down the hydraulic pump. For 3 seconds, the P-47 continued straight and level on momentum. Then the nose dipped. The right wing dropped 6 degrees. The aircraft began an uncommanded descent. In the tower, Garrett muttered, "There it is finished." But Whitmore followed the procedure card. Trim tabs to preset. Throttle adjustment for pitch recovery. Pulse deflection inputs on the mechanical linkages. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The nose stabilized. The wings leveled. The descent arrested. Whitmore's voice came through the radio steady and controlled. Aircraft responding. I have directional control. Beginning maneuver sequence. For the next 31 minutes, Whitmore put the modified Thunderbolt through every combat maneuver in the fighter pilot's vocabulary. Level turns at 30 degrees bank. Climbing turns at 45 degrees. Split S reversals. Barrel rolls. High-speed dives to 380 miles per hour with controlled pullouts. Simulated gun passes against an imaginary target. Each maneuver was logged, timed, and measured against the same maneuvers performed with full hydraulics during the morning's baseline flight. The results silenced every skeptic in the tower. Turn rate without hydraulics was 78% of normal. Roll rate was 64% of normal. Pitch authority was 81% of normal. The aircraft could not perform at full combat capability, but it could fight. It could evade. It could survive. A pilot with a destroyed hydraulic system was no longer a dead man falling from the sky. He was a wounded fighter with reduced but genuine combat capability. At minute 23, Whitmore executed the test that Hargrove had specifically designed to answer the board's deepest concern. He simulated a combat engagement against two chase aircraft P-47s flown by experienced pilots from the 356th Fighter Group who had been briefed to fly aggressive intercept patterns. Without hydraulics, Whitmore evaded 6 attack passes and achieved simulated firing solutions on both chase aircraft. The gun camera footage confirmed it. Whitmore landed at 0947 hours. The aircraft touched down normally, using Hargrove's emergency landing procedure, which relied on differential braking and engine power modulation rather than hydraulic nose-wheel steering. The landing was rough. The Thunderbolt veered 15 degrees left of centerline before Whitmore corrected. But it was controlled. It was survivable. It was proof. Garrett, the Republic. Aviation engineer who had predicted failure stood in silence for 11 seconds after reviewing the flight data. Then he said 5 words that changed the trajectory of the air war. We need to study this further. It was not an endorsement, but it was no longer a rejection. Kepner made the decision that afternoon. Deploy the modification to all P-47 groups in 8th Fighter Command. Priority installation beginning immediately. Training for all fighter pilots within 30 days. Hargrove was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to lead the installation and training program personally. The deployment was massive in scope and brutal in execution. 47 P-47 groups across eastern England. Over 800 aircraft requiring modification. Hargrove had 6 weeks before the spring offensive, the massive push across the Rhine that would crack open the heart of Germany. He organized 12 installation teams, each trained personally in his technique. They worked 18-hour days, moving from base to base, modifying aircraft and briefing pilots. The resistance was fierce. Squadron commanders who had flown combat for 2 years resented being told their aircraft needed modification by a staff sergeant who had never fired his guns in anger. Pilots who trusted their machines with religious devotion viewed the modification as tampering. At the 78th Fighter Group, a major told Hargrove directly that he would rather take his chances with a dead hydraulic system than trust a grease monkey's backyard engineering. Hargrove responded by climbing into a P-47, taking off, shutting down the hydraulics at 10,000 feet, and flying a full combat demonstration in front of the entire group. He was not yet a rated pilot. He had completed only basic flight training. He flew the demonstration on mechanical skill instinct and the absolute conviction that his system worked. The major never questioned him again. By March 1, 1945, 340 P-47s had been modified. Pilot briefings had reached 60% of 8th Fighter Command's fighter pilots. And on March 2nd, the first real-world validation arrived in the most dramatic way imaginable. Lieutenant Carl Emerson of the 353rd Fighter Group took 20mm cannon fire over Dortmund that destroyed his hydraulic system completely. Using Hargrove's technique, Emerson maintained control of his aircraft, shot down an attacking Messerschmitt 109, and flew 180 miles back to England on mechanical linkages alone. Before the modification, he would have been dead. Instead, he landed safely at Rhine with a destroyed hydraulic system and a confirmed kill. The German pilots began to notice. Crippled Thunderbolts that should have been easy kills were fighting back. Aircraft trailing hydraulic fluid visibly damaged were executing evasive maneuvers and returning fire with lethal accuracy. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from March 1945, captured after the war, noted with confusion that American P-47 fighters appeared to retain combat capability despite severe structural and systems damage. The source of this capability was listed as unknown. But the success created a new danger that nobody, not Hargrove, not Kepner, not Forsyth, had anticipated. By mid-March, Luftwaffe signals intelligence had intercepted enough Allied radio traffic to identify that a specific modification was being deployed across American fighter units. They did not know the details. They did not know how it worked. But they knew something had changed. And on March 18, 1945, a German intelligence directive was issued to all Western Front Jagdgeschwader units. Priority: identify and capture intact any American P-47 aircraft exhibiting unusual flight characteristics following combat damage. If capture is impossible, ensure total destruction. The Germans were hunting for Hargrove's secret. And in 14 days, they would get closer to finding it than anyone in the Allied command structure could have imagined. Because on March 2nd, the very day Emerson proved the modification worked in combat, Staff Sergeant Billy Hargrove received his own orders. Combat flight status: effective immediately. Destination: the Rhine corridor. The deadliest airspace in Europe. And the real war was only beginning. A former auto mechanic from Indiana invented a way to fly a P-47 Thunderbolt without hydraulics. The brass laughed. Then they tested it. Then they deployed it to 340 aircraft across 8th Fighter Command. And on March 2, 1945, Lieutenant Carl Emerson proved it worked in combat shooting down a Messerschmitt 109 with a dead hydraulic system over Dortmund. The modification was saving lives. But the Germans had noticed. Luftwaffe signals intelligence intercepted Allied radio traffic identifying that American fighters were surviving damage that should have been fatal. On March 18th, a priority directive went out to every Jagdgeschwader on the Western Front. Find out what the Americans have changed. Capture an intact P-47 if possible. If not, destroy it completely. The secret Billy Hargrove built in a freezing English hangar was now the target of a German intelligence operation. Between March 1st and March 25th. 1945, Luftwaffe fighter units on the Western Front lost 847 aircraft. That was a 34% increase over February losses. Something had changed in the air war, and the German High Command knew it. And now this was no longer an experiment. This was total war. General Major Dietrich Speltz, commander of Jagdkorps II responsible for fighter defense of the Rhine sector, convened an emergency tactical conference at his headquarters in Darmstadt on March 20th. The briefing documents captured after the war reveal the depth of German confusion. Peltz's intelligence officer, Oberstleutnant Werner Hoffmann, presented gun camera footage from 14 separate engagements in which damaged American P-47s continued to maneuver and fight after sustaining hits that should have rendered them uncontrollable. The footage showed Thunderbolts trailing hydraulic fluid in visible streams, their control surfaces visibly damaged, executing turns, rolls, and firing passes that defied the known performance envelope of a hydraulically disabled aircraft. Hoffman's assessment was blunt. The Americans have either developed a new hydraulic system with redundant backups, or they have found a method of mechanical flight control that we do not understand. Either possibility represents a significant tactical threat. Peltz ordered an immediate tactical response. German pilots were instructed to concentrate fire on P-47 wing roots and engine mounts rather than fuselage and tail sections. The logic was sound. If the Americans could fly without hydraulics, then destroying the engines or structural wing integrity became the only reliable kill method. This shift in targeting doctrine required retraining and cost precious weeks of adjustment. but the impact was already devastating. In the 3 weeks following the modification's deployment, P-47 groups reported a 23% decrease in combat losses. Aircraft that would have been written off as total kills were returning to base. Pilots who would have died were landing, getting patched up, and flying again the next day. The Luftwaffe's kill ratio against Thunderbolts dropped from 1 kill per 14 engagements to 1 kill per 22 engagements. For every German pilot celebrating a confirmed victory, 8 more were watching their targets escape. The frustration manifested in increasingly reckless German tactics. Pilots pressed attacks to suicidally close range, trying to guarantee structural kills. 3 Focke-Wulf 190 pilots in a single week were shot down by the very Thunderbolts they thought they had crippled. The hunters were becoming the hunted. But the German response was not the only challenge Hargrove faced. On March 14th, a P-47 from the 356th Fighter Group crashed on landing at Martlesham Heath after its pilot attempted to use Hargrove's technique following hydraulic failure. The aircraft cartwheeled off the runway, killing the pilot instantly. Investigation revealed that the modification had been installed incorrectly. A critical trim tab linkage had been reversed, creating the opposite control input from what the procedure card specified. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Francis Tierney, 22 years old, followed Hargrove's emergency card exactly. Every input he made drove the aircraft further out of control. The accident triggered an immediate review. Strickland, who had opposed the modification from the beginning, demanded a full suspension of the program. In a memorandum dated March 16th, he wrote that the Tierney incident validates my original assessment that unauthorized modifications to flight-critical systems by unqualified personnel create unacceptable risk. 1 pilot saved does not justify 1 pilot killed by the modification itself. The accusation hit Hargrove like a physical blow. Tierney was dead because someone on one of the 12 installation teams had made an error. An error in a system Hargrove had designed to be simple enough to install correctly every time. He had been wrong. Not about the physics. Not about the technique. About the assumption that every installation would be perfect. In war, nothing is ever perfect. Forsyth's statistical analysis saved the program. She compiled the data with ruthless precision. Since deployment, 23 pilots had used Hargrove's technique following hydraulic failure. 20 had survived. 3 had died, including Tierney. The survival rate with the modification was 87%. Without it, the historical survival rate was 9%. Even accounting for the installation error, the modification was saving 10 times more lives than it cost. Kepner reviewed the numbers. The program continued, but with a critical change. Hargrove personally inspected every installation. Every single one. He slept 3 hours a night for 2 weeks, traveling between bases, checking linkages, verifying trim tab settings, ensuring that no other pilot would die because of a reversed connection. But then a single mission changed everything. March 26, 1945. The Rhine crossing at Remagen. The Ludendorff Bridge. The only intact bridge across the Rhine had been captured by American forces on March 7th. For 3 weeks, the Germans had thrown everything at it. Artillery, V-2 rockets, demolition teams, Luftwaffe bombers. The bridge was the strategic choke point of the entire Western Front. If it held Allied armor, would pour across the Rhine into the German heartland. If it fell, the crossing would be delayed by weeks. On March 26th, the Luftwaffe launched its largest concentrated air attack in 3 months. 114 aircraft. Messerschmitt 262 jets, Focke-Wulf 190s, Arado 234 jet bombers. Their mission was to destroy the bridge and the pontoon crossings that American engineers had built alongside it. 8th Fighter Command scrambled every available fighter to intercept. Billy Hargrove flew that day, his 4th combat mission. His aircraft was a P-47D serial number 44-20763, nicknamed Terre Haute Special by his ground crew. He took off from Martlesham Heath at 06:23 hours as part of a 16-ship formation from the 356th Fighter Group. The formation reached the Remagen sector at 0641. Below them, the Rhine gleamed in early morning light. The bridge was visible, scarred and sagging, but standing. American troops and vehicles streamed across, and from the east, the German strike force was inbound. Contact: 16+ bandits, 12 o'clock low, mixed formation, 262S and 190S. The P-47S dove to intercept. Hargrove pushed the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney engine roared to 2,800 RPM. Airspeed climbed through 400 miles per hour. The first pass was chaos. Thunderbolts and Focke-Wulfs merged in a swirling dogfight at 15,000 feet above the river. Hargrove fired his first burst at an FW-190 crossing from right to left at 300 yards. His .850 caliber machine guns hammered. Tracers arced across the sky. The rounds struck the Focke-Wulf's engine cowling. Smoke erupted. The German pilot rolled inverted and dove away, trailing flame. Kill number 1. Hargrove banked hard left, scanning for threats. A Messerschmitt 262 flashed past below, impossibly fast, its twin jet engines leaving contrails. He couldn't catch it. Nobody could. But the 262 was heading for the bridge, and Hargrove was above it. He rolled into a diving attack, using altitude for speed. The P-47 screamed downward at 450 miles per hour. He fired a deflection shot at the 262 as it pulled up from its bombing run. The burst caught the jet's right engine nacelle. Pieces flew off. The 262 yawed violently, its pilot fighting for control. It crashed into a hillside east of Remagen. Kill number 2. Then the hydraulics died. A 20mm round from an unseen attacker punched through the fuselage beneath Hargrove's seat. The hydraulic reservoir ruptured. Fluid sprayed across the cockpit floor. The control stick went slack. Warning lights blazed across the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure 0. Any other pilot in any other aircraft would have been finished. Hargrove was not any other pilot, and this was not any other aircraft. He had designed this moment, not planned it, not wanted it. But every hour in Hangar 7, every calculation, every unauthorized test had prepared him for exactly this. Trim tabs to preset. Throttle modulation for pitch. Pulse deflection on mechanical linkages. The P-47 steadied. It responded. Clumsily, sluggishly, but it responded. And Billy Hargrove kept fighting. Over the next 31 minutes, flying without hydraulics above the most important bridge in Europe. Staff Sergeant William Hargrove shot down 8 more enemy aircraft. An FW-190 that made the fatal mistake of assuming the visibly damaged Thunderbolt was helpless. A second 190 that followed its wingman into the same trap. A third that Hargrove caught in a slow, wallowing turn that no German pilot expected from a crippled fighter. 2 more Focke-Wulfs in a single firing pass as they lined up for a strafing run on the bridge. A Messerschmitt 109 that Hargrove bounced from above, using gravity and engine power instead of control surfaces. 2 more 190s in the final minutes as German formations withdrew eastward, their attack broken. 10 confirmed kills in 47 minutes, without hydraulics. When Hargrove landed at a forward airstrip near Remagen, the P-47 had 247 bullet and shrapnel holes. The hydraulic system was completely destroyed. 3 of the 8 machine guns had jammed from sustained firing. Fuel remaining 43 gallons, enough for approximately 11 more minutes of flight. The ground crew at the airstrip stared at the aircraft. They stared at the pilot climbing out of the cockpit, with hydraulic fluid soaked into his flight suit from the waist down. They stared at the gun camera footage when it was developed 6 hours later. The news spread through 8th Fighter Command within 24 hours. A staff sergeant, a former mechanic, 10 kills in a single mission, without hydraulics. Using a technique he invented himself. The story was so extraordinary that General Kepner personally reviewed the gun camera footage frame by frame before authorizing the combat report. The impact was seismic. Hargrove's mission at Remagen became the single most dramatic validation of any field modification in the history of the Army Air Forces. Within 1 week, every remaining P-47 group that had not yet received the modification demanded immediate installation. The modification rate tripled. By April 10, 1945, 94% of all P-47s in the European theater carried Hargrove's system. The statistical transformation was staggering. In April 1945, not a single P-47 pilot died from hydraulic failure in combat. 0. Down from an average of 19 per month in the preceding year. Total P-47 combat losses dropped by 31% compared to March. Pilots reported engaging in extended combat, even after sustaining severe damage, something previously unthinkable. The Luftwaffe's response was desperate. Captured German documents from April 1945 reveal that Jagdkorps II issued revised tactical doctrine requiring a minimum of 3 fighters to engage any single P-47, up from the previous standard of 2. The resource cost was enormous. Every additional fighter assigned to kill a single Thunderbolt was a fighter unavailable for bomber interception or ground attack. Hargrove's modification did not just save fighter pilots. It forced the Luftwaffe to dilute its already depleted strength across every engagement. 8th Air Force Headquarters estimated that the modification directly saved 127 pilots between March and May 1945. Indirectly, by forcing Luftwaffe tactical changes that weakened bomber interception, it contributed to reduced bomber losses estimated at 340 aircraft and 3,400 crew members. The total impact measured in human lives exceeded 3,500 men who came home because a mechanic from Indiana refused to accept that a broken hydraulic system meant death. Hargrove received the Distinguished Service Cross on April 14, 1945, personally pinned by General Kepner at a ceremony at Martlesham Heath. The citation read in part for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat and for technical innovation of exceptional merit that materially contributed to the success of Allied air operations over Europe. He was promoted to Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank he could hold without a commission. Margaret Forsyth received the Legion of Merit for her statistical work that preserved the program during the Tierney crisis. Colonel Gruber received the Bronze Star. Lieutenant Whitmore, the pilot who first tested the impossible, received the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. But behind the medals and the numbers and the strategic assessments, there was a question that the ceremonies did not answer. What happens to the man who changed everything? What happens to Billy Hargrove after the war ends? After the last Focke-Wulf falls, after the guns go silent, and the hangars go dark? The story of Pennsylvania Steel and Impossible Flight has one final chapter. A chapter about what victory costs the men who earn it. About what happens when the mechanic who saved thousands comes home to Terre Haute and discovers that the skills that made him extraordinary in war have no place in peace. About a secret that Billy Hargrove carried for 40 years that nobody, not Kepner, not Forsyth, not even his wife, ever knew. That chapter belongs to part 4, and it is the part of this story that will stay with you longest. A 23-year-old auto mechanic from Terre Haute, Indiana, discovered that a P-47 Thunderbolt could fly without hydraulics. The military establishment laughed. He built it anyway. They tested it in secret. It worked. They deployed it across 8th Fighter Command. And on March 26, 1945, above the bridge at Remagen, Billy Hargrove proved his invention with his own hands, shooting down 10 enemy aircraft in 47 minutes, while flying a fighter that every manual said should have been a coffin. His modification saved an estimated 3,500 lives before the war ended. But what happened to the man behind the number? The medals were pinned. The reports were filed. The war ground toward its final weeks. And Billy Hargrove carried a secret that would take 4 decades to surface. Because sometimes the price of changing history is paid long after the guns fall silent. And sometimes the men who save thousands cannot save themselves. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Staff Sergeant William Declan Hargrove, now Master Sergeant Hargrove, stood on the flight line at Martlesham Heath and watched the celebrations from a distance. Men drank. Men cried. Men fired flare guns into the English sky. Hargrove walked back to Hangar 7, sat down at his workbench, and stared at his hands for an hour. The hands that had built the modification. The hands that had gripped the control yoke over Remagen. The hands that belonged to a man who no longer knew what to do with them. He was discharged on September 14, 1945 at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The Army offered him a commission. Second lieutenant with assignment to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, the center of Army Air Force's research and development. Hargrove turned it down. The official reason was personal. The real reason was something he told no one. He went home to Terre Haute. He reopened his father's garage on Wabash Avenue. Robert Hargrove had died of a stroke in March 1944. Alone in the shop, found by a customer the next morning with a wrench still in his hand. Billy inherited the building, the tools, the debts. He fixed trucks. He fixed tractors. He fixed the transmissions and engines that Terre Haute's working men depended on. Margaret Forsyth wrote to him 3 times in 1946. She had been reassigned to the Pentagon's Statistical Analysis Division and was compiling the official history of field modifications in the European theater. She wanted Hargrove's personal account, his recollections, his technical notes. He never responded. Colonel Gruber, promoted to brigadier general, invited Hargrove to a ceremony at the Pentagon in 1947 honoring wartime innovators. Hargrove declined by telegram. 2 words: cannot attend. Lieutenant Robert Whitmore, the pilot who first tested the impossible, drove from Savannah to Terre Haute in the summer of 1948 to visit Hargrove. He found a quiet man in oil-stained coveralls who was polite, distant, and unwilling to discuss the war. They shared a beer. They talked about engines. Whitmore left after 3 hours and later wrote to Forsyth that Hargrove seemed like a man deliberately erasing himself from his own story. The garage prospered in a modest way. Hargrove married Ellen Kowalski in 1950, a schoolteacher from neighboring Brazil, Indiana. They had 2 sons, Robert, born in 1952, and James, born in 1955. Hargrove was a good father, patient, quiet. He taught his boys to fix engines the way his father had taught him. He never told them about the war. When Robert found his father's Distinguished Service Cross in a shoebox in the attic in 1968, Hargrove took it from him without explanation and never spoke of it. He fixed cars for 41 years. He died on November 3, 1986, at age 64 of pancreatic cancer. The obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune-Star read William D. Hargrove, 64, automotive mechanic veteran of World War II. 6 lines. No mention of Remagen. No mention of 10 kills. No mention of 3,500 lives. But his legacy did not die with him, not even close. The principal Billy Hargrove discovered in Hangar 7 that a fighter aircraft could maintain combat capability through mechanical backup systems. When primary hydraulics failed, became one of the foundational concepts of modern military aviation design. The engineers at Republic Aviation, who initially dismissed his modification, studied it extensively after the war. Their analysis, published as an internal technical report in 1947, concluded that Hargrove's approach identified a critical vulnerability in single-point hydraulic systems that the original P-47 design had failed to address. That report influenced the design of every subsequent American fighter aircraft. The F-84 Thunderjet, Republic's first post-war fighter, incorporated a dual redundant hydraulic system directly inspired by Hargrove's work. The concept of mechanical backup flight controls, trim tab override systems, and emergency manual reversion modes became standard across the industry. When North American Aviation designed the F-86 Sabre for the Korean War, the engineering specifications included a requirement for minimum combat maneuverability under complete hydraulic failure. The test protocol for that requirement was based on Hargrove's original emergency procedure card, the 1-page document he wrote in a freezing English hangar in January 1945. The principle extended beyond fighters. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, which entered service in 1955 and remains in operational use today, incorporates a manual flight control reversion system whose design philosophy traces directly to the lessons learned from Hargrove's modification. The aircraft that carries America's nuclear deterrent can be flown in emergency using techniques that a mechanic from Indiana invented 80 years ago. In the decades since World War II, hydraulic redundancy and mechanical backup systems have saved an estimated 1,200 military pilots across all branches of the American Armed Forces. That number comes from a 2003 study by the Air Force Safety Center at Kirtland Air Force Base, which analyzed every hydraulic failure incident in USAF history and calculated the survival rate improvement attributable to backup systems derived from wartime field modifications. 1,200 pilots, 1,200 families that received phone calls instead of telegrams. 1,200 Thanksgivings with a father at the table instead of a folded flag on the mantle. The civilian aviation industry adopted the same principles. Modern commercial aircraft, from the Boeing 737 to the Airbus A380, incorporate multiple redundant hydraulic systems with mechanical backup modes. The Federal Aviation Administration's certification requirements for transport category aircraft mandate demonstrated controllability following complete hydraulic failure. Every commercial flight you have ever taken was safer because of engineering principles that began with a staff sergeant's unauthorized experiment in 1945. But the biggest lesson from Billy Hargrove's story is not about hydraulics or aircraft or engineering. It is about who gets heard. Every military in history, every corporation, every institution has a Billy Hargrove somewhere in its ranks. Someone who sees the problem from the ground level. Someone whose hands are dirty with the reality that headquarters never touches. Someone with an answer that the chain of command is structurally incapable of hearing. The Army Air Forces almost lost Hargrove's innovation. Not because it did not work, not because the data was unclear, but because a brigadier general decided that a staff sergeant with no degree could not possibly understand aircraft systems better than 3,000 Republic aviation engineers. The institutional reflex to dismiss expertise that comes without credentials nearly killed 3,500 men who instead came home alive. This pattern repeats across history. Percy Spencer, a man with no college education, invented the microwave oven in 1945 when he noticed a chocolate bar melting in his pocket near a magnetron. His employer, Raytheon, initially dismissed the observation. Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet air defense lieutenant colonel, prevented nuclear war in 1983 by trusting his instincts over his instruments when early warning systems falsely reported an American missile launch. His superiors reprimanded him for breaking protocol. In every case, the individual who saw clearly was opposed by the institution that could not. Today, the same dynamic plays out in technology companies, in hospitals, in governments. The engineer who flags a safety concern. The nurse who questions a procedure. The analyst who challenges a strategy. The mechanic who knows what breaks and why. The question is never whether these people exist. They always exist. The question is whether the institution is capable of listening before the cost of not listening becomes catastrophic. And there is one final detail about Billy Hargrove that almost no one knows. In 1983, 3 years before his death, Hargrove's wife Ellen was cleaning out the attic of their Terre Haute home. Behind a false panel in an old footlocker, she found a notebook. 72 pages, handwritten in pencil, dated between October 1944 and January 1945. The notebook contained Hargrove's original technical analysis of the P-47's hydraulic system vulnerability. Diagrams, calculations, failure mode predictions, design specifications for the modification that would eventually save thousands of lives. But the notebook also contained something else. 30 pages at the back separated by a blank page written in a different hand. Smaller, more careful. These pages were letters. 17 letters addressed to the families of P-47 pilots who had died from hydraulic failure before Hargrove completed his modification. letters he wrote but never sent. Each one began the same way. "I am sorry I was not fast enough." Francis Tierney's family was among them, the pilot who died because of the reversed installation. Hargrove had written to his parents 3 separate times, each draft longer and more anguished than the last. None were mailed. He carried the weight of every pilot he could not save alongside the knowledge of every pilot he did save, and he never told anyone which burden was heavier. Ellen Hargrove donated the notebook to the National Air and Space Museum in 1988. It is catalogued as Item 2003-0247 in the museum's archives. It is not on public display. If you ask, a curator will bring it to you in the reading room, and you can hold in your hands the 72 pages that changed aviation forever, followed by 30 pages of grief that changed nothing at all except the heart of the man who wrote them. From a small-town mechanic with an idea, the entire military establishment called insane, to a modification that saved 3,500 lives in 3 months and reshaped aircraft design for the next 80 years. Billy Hargrove proved that genius does not require a degree, that courage does not require permission, and that the people closest to the problem are almost always closest to the solution. He never sought fame. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave an interview. He fixed cars in Terre Haute, Indiana for 41 years, and he died with 6 lines in the local paper. But somewhere in the archives of the Smithsonian, in a notebook filled with diagrams and unsent letters, his voice still speaks, not to generals or engineers or historians, to every person who has ever seen a broken system and known with absolute certainty that they could fix it if someone would only let them try. If you know a story like Billy Hargrove's, a story of someone who changed everything and was forgotten, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig through the archives every week, finding the ordinary people who did extraordinary things and then vanished into silence. Your like, your comment, your subscription, that is what keeps these stories alive. 72 pages of engineering brilliance. 30 pages of unsent apologies. One man who saved thousands and mourned the ones he could not reach in time. That is the story of Billy Hargrove. And the only tragedy greater than the lives lost in that war is the possibility that stories like his might be forgotten entirely. They will not be. Not here. Not while you are listening.